Welcome back everyone, Borfling here. Earlier today we got our first Nintendo Direct of 2021. Now while they showed a couple of interesting games, there was one from Square Enix that really stood out to me, and that's Project Triangle Strategy. And it just might be the spiritual successor to Final Fantasy Tactics that I've been waiting for. Luckily for us, Nintendo also dropped a demo for the game right after the presentation. Now I've already played through it and thought it might be fun to take a look and see what this game has to offer. Now before we begin, I just want to say that I'm not going to be touching on any of the story elements of this demo. You get dropped right into Chapter 6, which they say is somewhere in the middle of the game, and you don't have a lot of context for who everyone is or what's going on. Luckily they added a nice fast forward feature that allows you to skip over all the dialogue, and I use this to avoid any spoilers because if this game is half as interesting as say Final Fantasy Tactics, I want to experience the story in its entirety and not just this, weird section in the middle. Now with that said, let's jump right in. Square is calling this the second entry in their HD 2D series, the first entry being Octopath Traveler, and right off the bat, if you weren't a fan of the way that game looked, you're not going to be a fan of this one either. The characters are nicely designed pixel art sprites, and the unfiltered environment textures are equally pixelated, making the whole thing look and feel like a top-tier PlayStation 1 era JRPG. On top of all that, you have all the modern flourishes that are used to make this game feel HD. You've got the dynamic lighting and shadows, and the depth of field that's used to smooth out the background and obscure foreground elements during gameplay. This mix of old and new feels original and nostalgic at the same time. It's a really great modern interpretation of the old pixel art, tactical RPG art style. Even the spell and ability effects look and feel awesome, and they also use the same mix of old school pixel art and modern technology. Every time you cast one, the camera zooms in and darkens the environment, which helps emphasize the dynamic lighting produced by the ability, and makes the whole thing feel exciting and dramatic. I think the visuals for this game are just fantastic, and I would love if other studios look to the past for inspiration like Square has. They've really leveraged a timeless look, and I'm hoping this is not the last time we get a game in this HD 2D series. Now the game isn't being released until 2022, so there are quite a few aspects of the presentation that weren't nearly as polished. For example, the user interface features some finely illustrated portraits, but the icons for spells and abilities leave a lot to be desired. I'm hoping before the game ships they give as much attention to detail to the UI as they have to the rest of the game. On the audio side, things are sounding pretty good. Just take a listen to some of this battle music. Time will tell whether or not this soundtrack will hold a candle to Final Fantasy Tactics, but so far I think it's sounding pretty decent. The sound effects also sound great, however there are quite a few spells that were missing their audio entirely, but again this is to be expected for a game that's not shipping for at least another year. The game starts out with a 2D cutscene that gives you some context to the story. There are 3 neighboring nations on the continent of Norzelia: Glenbrook, Acefrost, and Hyzant, and each nation has total control over a different vital resource, which is causing a lot of conflict between them. But before they could totally destroy each other, a peace treaty was negotiated. That wasn't until this handsome guy, Gusted off of Acefrost, came to power and decided it was time to invade Glenbrook. The main protagonist is a young dude from Glenbrook named Serenoa, who rushes to aid the royal family, and with him are a whole cast of characters that I assume are going to help you fight off this evil Gus guy and bring some peace to the entire nation. From there, the player is presented with quite a few in-game cutscenes featuring a ton of dialogue. One nice feature that they added is that when any character is talking, you can hit the X button to bring up a really basic profile screen. It only includes the name and title of the character and a cool portrait, but it might be helpful if you find yourself forgetting who's who and what their importance to the story is. Like I said earlier, I skipped over the story here to avoid any spoilers, so I don't really have much to comment on, but again, the characters' environments all look pretty cool. After a healthy amount of dialogue to skip through, you finally come to your first battle sequence. You and your party are on a bridge and are waiting for a boat to come rescue you. However, the enemy forces appear and you have to fight your way through them, open a gate, and move all your units through the gate to escape. I like that there's a small objective to this mission. It's not just a simple kill all the enemies and win type deal. Before the battle begins, the game introduces you to the exploration phase. In between story scenes and battles, you're given the chance to roam around, look for items, speak to other characters, and explore the environment for features that might help you in the coming battle. You have a lot of control over the camera, so it's a good idea to rotate around and look for some hidden ladders or stairs that might lead to some valuable items. There is also an orthographic top-down view that might be useful during battle when things get a bit cluttered. A key feature that was showcased in the presentation was how the game allowed the player to take an active role in making important decisions in the story. Here we see our first example of this. Characters with exclamation marks over their head have dialogue options as part of their conversation. Depending on your choice, the story will probably play out in significantly different ways. They call this the conviction system. The game explains that Norzelia has 3 major guiding convictions: utility, morality, and liberty. Your choices will shape Serenoa's convictions and influence which characters choose to join you in your cause. Once you've finished the exploration phase, we're introduced to the world map. Here we're given a few different locations to choose from, each with a different colored exclamation mark. Green ones denote side stories and the red ones are for the main story. We also gain access to the main menu. Here we can look at our party, our inventory, review any tutorials, access the options menu, save our game, and enter the encampment. Let's start with the party menu. The demo starts you out with 9 party members, each with a unique class. And it looks like each class is thematically tied to that character, so unfortunately it appears we won't be getting a highly customizable job system like Final Fantasy Tactics had. Anyways, here we can see each character, their name, class, HP, resistances, stats, equipment, and abilities. Most characters seem to have a mix of active and passive abilities, and the little yellow diamonds reflect the TP cost of each ability. We'll get to TP a bit later on. The ability tooltips provide useful info like the power of the ability, the range in both horizontal and vertical distances, and a description of any additional effects the ability might have. While each class is pretty unique, they do fit into your typical archetypes. You've got your standard fighter class in the soldier and spear knight, support classes in the strategist and physician, casters with the conjurer and scholar, the spy is pretty thief-like, the scout is a new take on the archer, and the shield bearer is your typical tank. Now, let's check out the encampment. Here you can get yourself ready for battle by buying items and quituses, or quituses. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but more on those later. The game also takes the time to let you know that more options will be available in the encampment when the game is finished, but for now there were only 2 NPCs that really did anything. The 2 that were implemented were the item vendor and the quitus vendor. Right now all the items seem to have generic placeholder names, and there are 2 types of currency, one for items and one for the quituses. There appears to be an NPC who can repair armor, one who's conducting research for you, and one who can give you additional side missions, but none of those were implemented yet. And finally, we can get into battle. In this first battle, my party was joined by an uncontrollable NPC with a green portrait. All the player characters had blue portraits and the enemies had red. There's some pretty handy UI improvements in this game that you won't find in Final Fantasy Tactics. When moving a unit, purple squares depict spaces that are vulnerable to enemy attack, and if an enemy is able to attack your unit on the next turn, it'll be illustrated with a red line connecting the 2 units. The game also tries to emphasize 2 keys to victory: positioning and initiative. When it comes to positioning, attacks from behind your foe or from above will deal greater damage, and as far as initiative goes, turn order is dependent on each unit's speed stat, and being aware of the turn order is pretty important in this game. Now from here you've got your basic tactical turn-based RPG. On a unit's turn, they have the ability to move and act, and you can decide which one of these you want to do first. After you've finished choosing what you want to do, the action plays out and you're given a choice of direction to face your character. Like the game mentioned earlier, your positioning is important, and you don't want to be taking unnecessary damage by giving your opponent access to your unit's backside. Now, I was really impressed with the diversity of playstyle each class had. The spy Anna gets 2 actions per turn, so she can attack an enemy and then use her take cover ability to go invisible and protect herself. Roland the spear knight rides on a horse and can move pretty far. His basic spear attack can hit 2 squares in front of him, and it'll pierce through the first enemy and hit the one behind it if there is one. The scout, Huette, rides a giant bird that can easily fly up to higher ground and rain down blinding arrows onto your enemies. The strategist, Benedict, can bestow an ally with a buff to their offense or defense. Serenoa the soldier has an interesting ability called Delayed Strike. It deals damage to an enemy but also delays that unit's next turn. Gila the physician is a potent healer who can restore your health and provide your team with a much needed haste buff. Eridor the shield bearer has a pretty handy AoE taunt and is able to ram enemies off their square and push them out of position. Corentin the scholar has a strong freezing spell and an ice wall spell that actually blocks off areas of the terrain. It makes for some pretty interesting positional gameplay. Frederica the conjurer uses fire magic to provide an ally with a fire shield that damages enemy attackers, and she also has a really strong AoE fire spell. In the Nintendo Direct presentation, they pointed out a lot of really cool synergy with the elemental schools of magic. For instance, you can freeze an area of the map, trapping your enemies in place, and then you can blast them with a strong fire spell, melting the ice into water. And then finally you can shock them with an electric spell that will deal additional damage due to the fact that they're standing in water. This isn't something I took the time to test myself, but it does look pretty cool and I might try to pull it off in the future. Something else to note is that there isn't any channeling time for spells or abilities. Once you choose them, they happen instantly on that turn. So unlike in Final Fantasy Tactics, you don't have to take that delay into consideration when choosing your next move. As I mentioned earlier, each ability has a different TP cost, and each unit starts off the battle with 1 TP. Some start with a bonus TP depending on their passive abilities. Whenever you use a normal attack or don't use an action at all, you gain an additional TP, allowing you to save up for more expensive and powerful moves. And if you position your units strategically, you're rewarded with some cool bonuses. I also mentioned that if you attack a unit from behind, you deal additional damage, but it actually also rewards you with a unit of currency called kudos, which are used to buy those quituses. And I promise I'll get to those in a bit. And if you successfully flank an enemy with 2 units and one of them attacks, it'll actually trigger a follow-up attack by your other flanking unit, and this also rewards you with 1 kudos. Depending on how well you position your units, you can actually get a back attack and a follow-up attack all in the same turn. One thing to note is that when a unit dies, they disappear entirely. There were no resurrection mechanics to bring back a fallen ally, but when the battle is over, the units are still in your party, so it doesn't seem like any of them die permanently. And sometimes when enemies die, they would drop an item that you could collect and receive at the end of the encounter. I found the combat to be immensely fun, and the game did an excellent job of explaining all the mechanics. If you've ever played a tactical RPG before, you pretty much know what to expect, but I still thought it had enough new bells and whistles to keep the gameplay feeling fresh and engaging. Once the fight is over, you get a screen that shows you your spoils of war and the currency that you gained. You're also able to see all the special conditions you met that earned you kudos, and I thought it was pretty cool to see all your achievements listed like that at the end of battle. After you finish with the first battle, you're taken back to the world map and you have a choice to check out some side stories or just stick to the main story. Eventually you're going to unlock some side stories that allow you to recruit new members to your party. These quests will have a special icon next to them, so you don't have to go around guessing which ones are going to lead to a new character or not. Finally, you'll reach a point in the story where the party has to make a major decision regarding one of its members. And this leads to our final main gameplay mechanic of Project Triangle Strategy, the voting stage. Here, the group is tasked with voting on a crucial choice that seems to have some pretty significant story and gameplay ramifications. Before the group casts their final votes, you have the ability to talk to each member and attempt to sway them to change their mind, depending on which outcome you desire. The game shows you which way your team members are leaning when it comes to the vote. However, just because you attempt to sway them doesn't mean that you will, and the game doesn't reveal to you if you change their mind or not until the final vote happens. To best equip yourself with some verbal ammunition to help change their mind, you have access to another exploration phase where you can go around, talk to some NPCs, and gain useful information. And some of this information will actually unlock additional verbal options when trying to sway your party members. Now, the choice that my group made culminated in one giant final battle. And unfortunately, the location of this final fight was in a peaceful allied town. And the enemy numbers were so overwhelming that I was actually given the option to burn down the town's buildings so that it would engulf the enemy in flames and kill them off much more quickly. This was another nice twist, not only made for a compelling combat decision, but also played into the conviction system mentioned earlier. After the battle concluded, the demo came to an end. So I don't know if burning down the town is going to have any story implications, but I'm really interested in finding out. So to wrap up my thoughts, I'll say this. If you're a fan of Final Fantasy Tactics or other tactical RPGs, then I would say this is definitely a game worth checking out. I mean, it's going to be a day one purchase for me, and I can't wait to see how they continue to update and change this game. Well, that's going to be it for me. This morning I had no idea I'd be making a video today, but Nintendo really surprised me, and here I am. And if you like this video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. It'll certainly help me grow this channel. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.